Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video lecture for Psych 370, Principles of Learning. As you can see in our course schedule here in the syllabus, your assigned reading for this week is Chapter 1 of the textbook. So in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of that chapter, and I'm also going to go into a bit more detail about some of the more important concepts from the chapter. And as always, guys, if you find yourself with questions about anything you read in the textbook or anything you hear in this video lecture, then please feel free to send me an email or drop by the Zoom meeting room during my office hours, and I'll try to get things cleared up for you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, with this being chapter 1, it largely serves as an introduction to the topic of learning. And the author begins by making the point that if you look at the environments that people and other animals occupy, you'll see that they're characterized by change. We live in an ever changing world. So, to survive in that world, we've got to be able to cope with change. And the chapter discusses two major mechanisms by which we do that. The first of those mechanisms is natural selection, which was first investigated by Charles Darwin and which I'm sure most of you guys are already familiar with. I still think you'll find that section of the chapter pretty interesting, though, because it includes a sort of historical account of how Darwin came to make the discoveries he made and have the insights that he had. So, during his travels, Darwin noticed that the world is populated by these vastly different species of plants and animals, right? There's this enormous diversity of life in the world, and what really intrigued him was the fact that it's possible to breed animals with certain characteristics by selecting individuals with those characteristics and having them procreate, having them reproduce. So, whatever characteristic you've selected, it's possible through breeding to make that characteristic more widespread in future generations than it is now. And obviously, that's not a new concept. Even back in Darwin's day, what we call selective breeding was already a thing. For example, breeders have used it to turn wild cattle into these domesticated milk producing cows, and of course, to transform wolves and wild dogs into tamer, friendlier creatures like poodles and cocker spaniels. So, when Darwin went about tackling this origin of species question, he already knew that many traits, both physical traits and behavioral traits, are heritable. They get passed on from parent to offspring. However, in the case of selective breeding, there's a clear guiding force that's steering the species in a particular direction, right? I mean, the breeders themselves identify the traits that they want their animals to have, and so they sort of guide each generation toward those traits by choosing which individuals reproduce with each other. So, in other words, with selective breeding, the breeders themselves control the process of inheritance by selecting which traits they want to get passed on and which ones they'd rather eliminate from their population. So, Darwin theorized that a process similar to selective breeding must take place in nature too. But he knew that obviously human beings don't dictate which wild animals reproduce and which ones don't. So, in other words, unlike selective breeding, no one's in charge of how wild animals evolve. So, to put it like your textbook puts it, what Darwin essentially had to figure out here was who nature's breeder is. And he got some important insight on that question when he realized that any given environment can only provide its inhabitants with a limited quantity of resources like food, water, and shelter. There's only so much of that stuff to go around. And what that means, of course, is that there's a limit to the size of the population that that environment can support. Only so many individuals can get enough of those limited resources to survive long enough to reproduce. And because of that, individuals have to compete with each other in their efforts to get the resources that they need. Furthermore, Darwin recognized that some individuals have traits that give them an upper hand in that competition for resources. So he proposed that those traits would become more and more prevalent in later generations because the individuals who possessed them would produce more offspring than those who didn't. And then over time, those advantageous traits could become so prevalent that they'd eventually come to dominate the population and characterize the species. So Darwin referred to this process as natural selection because he was basically proposing that nature is its own breeder. The environment itself sort of selects which traits will persist and which ones won't, because certain traits will be better suited for success in that environment than others will. So, in other words, there's obviously not a human being out there in the wild breeding these animals and controlling the rate at which different individuals reproduce. But different individuals do reproduce at different rates, just naturally. And that's largely because the environment fits some individuals' traits better than it does others. So, for that reason, the term fitness is often used to refer to an individual's ability to survive and reproduce in a certain environment, and natural selection is often referred to as the survival of the fittest. Okay, so that's how natural selection works. And guys, I want to go into a bit more depth with natural selection by boiling it down to three essential components. These are like the three necessary and sufficient conditions under which natural selection will occur. If all three of these conditions are met, then the process of natural selection will take place. So let's go through them. The first one is heritability, which I mentioned earlier. So offspring do inherit many of their traits from their parents, right? Many traits run in families, in other words. Now, Darwin knew that much. He knew that parents pass their traits on to their young. But today, mainly due to the work of a scientist named Gregor Mendel, we know that inheritance occurs because those traits have a genetic, or at least largely genetic, basis. So, in order for a trait to be selected for via natural selection, it has to be transmissible from parent to offspring. It has to have at least some degree of heritability. That's the first of these three conditions. In addition, another thing to keep in mind about natural selection is that it also requires that competition for limited resources that I talked about earlier. It has to be necessary for individuals to compete with each other to get access to the resources that they need. Now, that competition, of course, is going to have some winners and some losers. So, the winners will be the ones that go on to survive and reproduce, meaning they'll leave descendants who inherit their advantageous traits. And the losers will fail to reproduce, meaning that their disadvantageous traits will die out with them. So, guys, the reason that this competition for resources is important is because it leads to different rates of reproduction for different individuals. Those who possess advantageous traits, or what we often call adaptive traits, will reproduce more. And as a result, those traits will become more and more widespread in the population as the species continues to evolve. Okay, so traits have to be heritable, individuals have to compete for resources, and finally, the third condition here is a fairly obvious one that I haven't explicitly mentioned yet, but I think it's been sort of implied by what I've said so far. And that third condition is variability. In order for natural selection to occur, it has to be true that traits vary across individuals. Differences among individuals have to exist. Because if they don't, if there's no variability among individuals, if all of the individuals in a species have the same traits, then no one has an advantage in that competition for resources. And it doesn't really matter who mates with who, right? If everyone has the same traits, then the same traits are going to get passed down to the next generation, regardless of who's doing the reproducing. That next generation will be identical to the one that gave rise to it. And so no evolution will have taken place. So remember, what makes natural selection similar to selective breeding, or what we sometimes call artificial selection, is that these are both processes by which the unique features that some individuals have become more and more prevalent in subsequent generations. So neither of those processes, neither natural selection nor artificial selection, can occur if individuals don't have any unique features in the first place. So there has to exist at least some variability in the traits that different individuals have. Now, of course, just because the individuals in a population don't currently have any differences among them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they never will. Okay. For example, mutations represent one way by which the offspring in a given population can become more different from one another. So, a mutation, as defined on page 20 of your textbook, is an abrupt change in a gene. So, sometimes when a cell divides and copies its DNA, the DNA sequence that it copies is not an exact replica of the original. Sometimes there are errors in this copying process so that the new cell contains mutated genes that were not present in the parent cell. In many cases, these mutations can be inherited by offspring. So, if that mutated gene bestows a fitness advantage, if it gives the individual an edge in the competition for resources, then it could become more prevalent in the population. In other words, nature could select for that mutated gene if those who possess it are able to fare better, reproductively speaking, than those who don't possess it. Now, I should point out that most mutations are not advantageous like that. Okay. Most of them are disadvantageous, so they die out with their owners. But it's always possible for this process to sort of hit the jackpot and confer beneficial effects upon the organism in its struggle to survive and reproduce. So, if you haven't yet, then you'll read about mutations in the textbook along with other processes like hybridization that can increase the diversity of living organisms in the world and provide more variability for the process of natural selection to operate on. So, mutation is an interesting phenomenon that can help give rise to new adaptive traits in a species. But of course, when we talk about mutations affecting the process of natural selection, we're talking about how changes in individuals can affect which individuals are more or less fit in a given environment, right? For example, if individuals who possess trait A are currently dominating a population, well, a mutation producing a new trait, trait B, could sweep through that population if it allowed those who possessed it to deal even more successfully with the challenges that the environment presents. So, in other words, even if the environment never changed, mutations and other heritable changes in individuals could still lead to the evolution of new characteristics in a given species, or even to the evolution of an entirely new species altogether. However, going back to the point that was made at the beginning of the chapter, the environment does change. Climates change, terrains change, rivers dry up or change course. Some species occasionally become extinct, which forces the animals who preyed on those species to come up with other ways to sustain themselves. And so it's important to realize that these and other changes in the environment are going to affect the course of evolution too by influencing which traits are advantageous and which ones are not. So, guys, remember the reason that natural selection is covered in such detail in this opening chapter of the textbook is because it represents a major mechanism by which organisms cope with changes in their environment. And a particular change in that environment can make it so that traits which were once beneficial cease to be so, and at the same time, so that new traits can spread through the population and become dominant because they allow animals to flourish in this new environment that the species now inhabits. Now, the chapter presents several examples of this, but a classic one involves the case of the peppered moth, which is described on pages 8 and 9. Now, this species of insect feeds at night and it remains mostly inactive during the day, and its defense against predators involves a sort of camouflage where it blends in with the bark of the trees that it rests on during the day. Prior to the mid 1800s, most of the trees in these moths' environment were a sort of light gray color. So most of the moths themselves were similarly colored because that made them difficult for predators to detect. black peppered moths existed, but they were rare because they'd stand out against the lighter colored trees, making them easier prey for predators like birds. However, pollution during the 1800s caused an important change in the environment that these moths inhabited. The soot produced by industrial centers darkened the bark of the trees in the environment, and this change made it so that it was the lighter moths who stood out against the bark now, while the darker colored moths were now better able to conceal themselves from predators. And as a result of this environmental change, the species itself changed. The darker moths were now the ones with the advantage in terms of survival and reproduction. So, over the course of several generations, that variety of peppered moth became the more prominent one. The once dominant trait of having a light gray body color became less and less common because the environmental change robbed that trait of its adaptive benefits. Now, interestingly, improvements in air quality have caused the tree bark in these moths' environment to return to its original lighter color. And as a consequence of this more recent environmental change, the lighter variety of peppered moth has made a comeback. The darker variety has once again found itself at a disadvantage, and consequently, this variety of peppered moth is again the less common one. Now, of course, physical traits like body color aren't the only characteristics that can change in response to changes in the environment. Particular behaviors and behavioral tendencies can also confer advantages or disadvantages upon the individuals who perform and possess them. And because they, like physical traits, can also be inherited by offspring, they too are subject to the process of natural selection. Now, pages 11 through 18 of the textbook are devoted to a discussion of three types of behaviors that can change in response to environmental changes. So, I want to take a few minutes here to go through those three types of evolved behaviors with you. The first and simplest type is the reflex, which is defined as a relationship between a specific event and a simple response to that event. So, a good example of a reflex is the relationship between exposure to a painful event, like touching a very hot object, and the retraction of the body part that came into contact with that object. So, for example, if you make the unfortunate mistake of placing your hand on a hot stovetop, you're going to immediately withdraw that hand away from it, right? And that reflex obviously helps you protect yourself from injury. So, individuals who have that reflex tend to fare better in the fight for survival and reproduction than individuals who don't have it. And as a result, that reflex has gotten to the point where it's an almost universal feature in the animal kingdom. Natural selection has acted in favor of the reflex due to the advantages that it bestows on individuals who possess it. Another type of behavior that's also subject to natural selection pressure is a modal action pattern, an MAP, which is also known in the literature as a fixed action pattern because it involves a series of actions that the animal performs in a fairly rigid, fixed sequence. Like the simple responses that reflexes involve, the behaviors in a modal action pattern are also triggered by a particular event, a particular stimulus in the animal's environment. And guys, such an event is called a releaser. We call that a releaser because it sort of releases the sequence of behavior, it elicits it. And I should probably mention that the term sign stimulus is also in use. So you might come across that one too, but it's the same thing. Okay, sign stimulus is just another term for releaser. Either way, we're talking about a certain event, a certain stimulus in the animal's environment that triggers, that elicits a modal action pattern. Now, a classic example of a modal action pattern can be seen in a particular species of geese. And I actually have some old, kind of grainy footage of a goose performing that modal action pattern. So I'll show that to you now. Okay, so in that case, the releaser, the sign stimulus, is the side of an egg that's strayed away from the goose's nest, and that stimulus elicits this coordinated sequence of beak movements and backward steps by the mother goose. Now, interestingly, as I mentioned before, and as you saw in that video, this sequence is quite rigid. Once it's been initiated, it tends to continue through to its completion. So even when the egg was removed in the middle of that sequence, the goose continued to perform those actions that make up the modal action pattern. In other words, even though modal action patterns are more complex and more variable than simple reflexes are, they still tend to be very stereotypic, is the word. They tend to unfold in very predictable, very orderly ways. Also, like reflexes, modal action patterns tend to confer fairly obvious benefits to the individuals who perform them. So, for example, I think you can see the evolutionary benefit of a mother goose instinctively rolling a stray egg back to her nest, right? That modal action pattern helps the goose take better care of her young, and by extension, it also gives the goose a better chance of passing her own genes on down to future generations. And as the textbook discusses, other modal action patterns have similarly obvious benefits in terms of helping animals find food, avoid threats, reproduce, and so on. Now, of course, changes in an animal's environment can affect how advantageous those modal action patterns tend to be. So, we might expect a given change in the environment to result in some modification of a given modal action pattern. But the modal action patterns that we see animals exhibiting do tend to consist of behaviors that facilitate their abilities to survive and reproduce in the environments that they typically inhabit. By the way, speaking of modal action patterns and the releasers that elicit them, this is also a good time to mention something that's known in the literature as a supernormal stimulus, which is basically an exaggerated version of the releaser. Okay, it's an exaggerated, more extreme version of that sign stimulus that typically triggers the modal action pattern. We call that a supernormal stimulus. And guys, what's really interesting about supernormal stimuli is that not only can they elicit the modal action pattern, but they tend to be especially effective at doing so to the point that the animal may respond more strongly to them than they do to the actual releaser. So, for example, like geese, a species of bird called oyster catchers will also display a modal action pattern of rolling their eggs back to their nests and then sitting on top of them to incubate them. And the releaser for that modal action pattern is, again, the side of a stray egg that has certain features. For oyster catcher eggs, those features include a sort of grayish color with all these little speckled markings all over it. So when the bird sees an egg with those features, that releaser, that sign stimulus, will elicit the rolling and the incubating behaviors that make up the modal action pattern. But if you present the bird with an artificial egg that's a bit larger, a bit more brightly colored, and that has a bit more pronounced markings on it, then these birds will actually demonstrate a sort of preference for them over their own eggs. So, that exaggerated, supernormal version of the original stimulus, the original egg, will be even more effective at triggering the modal action pattern. So findings like that really help illustrate what it is about the releaser, what it is about the features that the releaser has that actually causes the animal to respond to it. Now, just because I think you'll find it interesting, I want to include a video here that's related to the concept of supernormal stimuli. So here that is.
People love beer. And the Australians are certainly no exception. It's an Antipodean institution. The Aussies drink nearly 2 billion litres of the stuff every year. So it's surprising to learn that the hand of the mighty Australian beer industry was forced by a small insect, the Australian jewel beetle. The male's mission in life is simple: find a female and mate with her. Male jewel beetles are always on the lookout for attractive females, like this fine specimen. But what makes her irresistible? Well, that's not too complicated. She's got to be big, she's got to be orange, and she's got to be covered in dimples. Give a male all three, and she's just gorgeous. It's sex on 6 legs. But what's all this got to do with beer? In Australia, a beer bottle like this is known as a stubby. And believe it or not, it nearly wiped out the jewel beetle. To this questing male, all his sexual fantasies come true when he finds a discarded stubby. It's certainly big, it's the right color, and it's got dimples. It's everything to whip a male into a frenzy. Such a beauty doesn't, of course, go unnoticed. Before long, it's covered in rampant males, and they're not keen to move elsewhere. Something had to be done. The genuine females were just sitting around unnoticed. Try as they might, they couldn't compete. Mr. Right had taken to the bottle. In the end, it was the beer industry that came to the jewel beetle's aid. Not previously known for its wildlife conservation, it ended up saving a whole species from extinction by simply changing the bottle design. Soon, the female jewel beetles were once again the only object of the male's affections. And they all lived happily ever after.
Okay, so normally, when one of those male beetles sees a big orange dimpled surface like that, it's a female beetle. So that stimulus is the releaser. That's the sign stimulus that elicits the reproductive behaviors, I guess we'll call them, by the male. But as you saw there, once those stubby beer bottles started showing up, well, they were bigger, more exaggerated versions of that same kind of stimulus. So they acted like a supernormal stimulus that was especially effective at eliciting those behaviors. And that's why the beer company had to change the bottle, right? To save the species by getting the males to pay more attention to the actual females. So, supernormal stimuli are pretty interesting. But anyway, modal action patterns are another type of behavior, in addition to reflexes, that can evolve in a species. And finally, one last way that natural selection can influence the behaviors that we see people and other animals exhibiting is by favoring the evolution of what your textbook refers to as general behavior traits. So, guys, a general behavior trait is defined as a tendency to engage in a certain kind of behavior, like aggressiveness or cautiousness or shyness. So, you can think of these as behavioral tendencies. And I'm sure that if you think about yourself or people that you know, you can probably identify certain tendencies that you and other people have to behave in certain ways, right? You have these general behavior traits. For example, I tend to be somewhat quiet and reserved, whereas my wife tends to be more outgoing. So there is certainly some variability in the general behavior traits that different individuals exhibit. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, another requirement of these traits, if they're going to be acted on by natural selection, is that they've got to be heritable. They have to have a tendency to get passed on from parents to offspring. And as it turns out, twin studies and other research methods have revealed quite convincingly that general behavior traits do have a tendency to run in families. For example, identical twins are more likely to display similar behavioral tendencies than fraternal twins are. And because identical twins are also more similar to one another genetically than fraternal twins are, this finding indicates that general behavior traits are influenced by genes. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that those traits are determined entirely by an individual's genes, but the point is that general behavior traits do have enough of a genetic basis. They're influenced strongly enough by our genes to satisfy that heritability requirement for natural selection that I talked about earlier. So, again, natural selection represents one major mechanism by which humans and other animals can cope with the changes that their environments present them with. However, one obvious and important limitation of natural selection is that it's slow, right? I mean, the changes in physical and behavioral characteristics that natural selection produces, those changes occur over the course of many generations. And because of that slowness, natural selection really isn't of much use when it comes to dealing with the sorts of abrupt changes that can occur during an individual animal's lifetime. In other words, even though natural selection does help a species cope with change, it's far less valuable as a way for individual organisms to cope with change. But of course, individuals do have a way to deal with the sorts of rapid, abrupt changes that can occur in the environment during their own lifetimes. And we are now ready to discuss this second major mechanism by which animals adapt to the world around them. We call it learning. Now, your textbook author begins his introduction to the concept of learning, logically enough, with a definition of it. So, simply put, learning can be defined as a change in behavior due to experience. A change in behavior that results from experience. That's learning. That's a simple definition of learning. So, in some cases, learning involves the acquisition of new behaviors. For example, we can learn to perform new skills, like how to play the guitar or how to drive a stick shift. But in other cases, learning actually involves eliminating or withholding a behavior. For example, we've all learned not to cross a street without looking both ways first, and kids learn, gradually, not to talk in class while their teacher is talking. So, guys, with learning, we're talking about changes in behavior that can go in either direction. Okay. If a behavior either increases or decreases in some way, then that change in behavior can qualify as learning. Now, another thing to keep in mind about this definition of learning is that it isn't the only definition that learning researchers agree on. For example, some psychologists would prefer to define learning as a change in what's often called behavioral potential. And guys, the point of that term, behavioral potential, is to define learning in terms of the behaviors that animals are capable of performing rather than simply the behaviors that they are currently performing. So, for example, you've all learned how to tie your shoes, right? And just because you aren't tying your shoes right now, it doesn't mean that you haven't learned to perform that behavior. You have learned it. You have the potential to perform that behavior. If your shoelaces become untied, you could demonstrate what you've learned by tapping into that behavioral potential that you have and performing the actual observable behavior of tying your shoes. So, because that behavior has become part of your bag of tricks, so to speak, because it's part of your behavioral repertoire, we'd say that it's something you've learned. We'd say it's a change in your behavioral potential that has occurred due to experience. So that's one revision to the textbook's definition that some psychologists would want to make. And another one would be to define learning as a long lasting change in behavior or behavioral potential. So you'll often see terms like enduring or durable or relatively permanent being used to describe the sorts of changes that qualify as learned changes. Now, your textbook author explicitly rejects this requirement in his definition of learning. Okay, partly because there's no well established consensus regarding how long lasting a learned change has to be in order to be considered durable or enduring. But I think it's important to recognize that not all experts in the field ignore the durability of the change in their definitions of learning. So, in other words, the definition that's presented in the textbook, starting on page 21, that definition doesn't necessarily represent a unanimous stance among psychologists regarding how learning should be defined. But still, despite those differences, for our purposes in this course, this relatively simple definition will suffice. We'll consider learning to be a change in behavior that arises due to experience. But of course, even that simple definition requires a bit more explanation in order to really clarify what learning is. In particular, we've got to define the terms behavior and experience, and pages 22 through 25 of the textbook are devoted to doing just that. First, behavior. What is behavior? This is obviously a very fundamental question for us, since psychology itself is defined as the study of behavior and mental processes. But as it turns out, behavior is another term whose definition is not unanimously agreed upon by experts in the field. Even leading authorities disagree to some extent on what exactly behavior is and how it should be defined. It's sometimes defined as just anything a person or animal does, but the author of your textbook provides a somewhat more technical definition of the term by defining behavior as anything a person or animal does that can be measured. So, according to this definition, measurability is required. In other words, when we study behavior, we're looking only at those things that animals do that we can somehow quantify, that we can measure. Now, given this definition, it's worthwhile to consider some examples in terms of whether they satisfy these criteria that our definition of behavior provides. So, for example, what about your heartbeat? Is the beating of your heart an example of a behavior? Well, even though many people would relegate that to the domain of physiology and not psychology, it is something that you do, and we can certainly measure it. We can count the number of beats per minute, for example. So, strictly speaking, the answer is yes, the beating of your heart qualifies as a behavior. A similar example is the secretion of saliva by your salivary glands. So, as we'll see in the coming weeks when we cover the topic of classical conditioning, changes in salivation can be produced by particular experiences, such as repeated pairings of a particular sound with the presentation of food. And those changes in salivary responses can certainly be considered learned changes in behavior. So clearly, there are examples out there of things that people and animals do that may not be commonly considered to be forms of behavior, but which do satisfy this definition of the term. Now, of course, a somewhat more controversial question that the textbook also addresses has to do with whether thinking qualifies as a behavior. So, for example, when you engage in so called inner speech, are you behaving? Some psychologists would say no. They'd argue that, well, thinking is an example of a mental process, and therefore it's clearly within the purview of psychology, but it doesn't count as behavior because it's not publicly observable. Our textbook author, on the other hand, argues that thinking is behavior. He refers to it as covert behavior. And in support of this claim, he cites research indicating that both overt and covert speech are affected by similar manipulations. And some research also does suggest that thinking may be measurable. So, for example, we can, in some cases and to some extent, tell what a person is thinking about by looking at their brain activity. So, this is an interesting question, and it's one about which reasonable people can disagree. But I'd encourage you to take some time to think about it on your own, while at the same time realizing that some experts, including your textbook author, do consider thinking to be a sort of private form of behavior. Okay, so for the sake of a definition, we will consider behavior to be anything that a person or other animal does that can be measured. Now let's turn our attention to experience. Remember, our definition of learning is that it involves changes in behavior that result from experience. So, what's experience? Well, as described on page 24 of the textbook, experience essentially involves changes in the environment, and those environmental changes, those environmental events, are known as stimuli. So, a stimulus can be defined as any event that affects or has the capability to affect behavior. So, guys, when we say that we've experienced something, what we mean is that we've encountered stimuli, right? We've been presented with certain events in our environment that have made that environment different from how it was before those events occurred. So, in other words, a stimulus is something that represents a change in your environment. So, experience can be simply defined as changes in the environment. And we could restate our definition of learning as changes in behavior due to changes in the environment, or as changes in behavior due to the occurrence of stimuli. Now, I realize that this way of defining a term as commonplace as experience might strike you as a little odd, so let me try to explain why experience is being defined this way by providing a basic example of learning and identifying the experience which causes the learned change in behavior. Now, the example involves classical conditioning, okay, which I mentioned earlier and which we'll focus on in more detail starting in week 4 of this course. But as I'm sure many of you already know, classical conditioning was first observed in dogs by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov noticed that if a dog was repeatedly presented with food after it had heard a particular sound, then the dog would eventually begin to salivate whenever the sound occurred, even when it was no longer followed by food. So prior to these repeated pairings of stimuli, the sound would not cause the dog to salivate, right? It would begin this process as what we'd call a neutral stimulus. And so, therefore, the dog's acquisition of salivation as a response to the sound represented a change in its behavior. And of course, the experience that caused that change in behavior was having one stimulus, the sound, reliably precede another stimulus, the food. The occurrence of each stimulus represented a change in the dog's environment, and the dog eventually learned to associate those two environmental events. In other words, it learned that the sound was an event, it was a stimulus that signaled that another event, another stimulus, the food, was about to occur. So I hope that simple example illustrates the idea that experiences always involve changes in an animal's environment. In other words, they always involve the occurrence of stimuli. In some cases, those stimuli are events that change the animal's external environment, as in the case of Pavlov's dogs, where the stimuli occurred outside of the dog's body. But in other cases, a stimulus can be an event that changes the animal's internal environment, such as when an empty stomach provokes hunger or when an addict experiences a craving for a particular drug. Okay, so learning is a change in behavior that results from experience. Behavior is anything an animal does that can be measured, and experiences involve changes in the environment. Now, before we move on from our definition of learning, one last thing that I should mention about it is that not all changes in behavior count as learned changes, including some that do result from changes in the environment. So there are some notable exceptions to what qualifies as an instance of learning. There are some ways in which behavior can change due to an environmental event that we don't consider to be cases of learning. One example like this involves the behavioral changes that drugs can produce. So, for example, if you expose a rat to a large dose of caffeine and then have that rat run in an exercise wheel, chances are that the rat is going to run much faster than it did when it wasn't under the influence of caffeine. But of course, you wouldn't say that that rat learned to run faster. You'd attribute that change in behavior to the drug that was administered. Similarly, if you sprain your ankle, or if you contract a virus, or if you get really tired, or if you become old and feeble, we will again see changes in the behaviors that you perform. You might become less active, for example, or slower, or less coordinated. But again, those changes don't qualify as learned changes in behavior. So these are important exceptions to keep in mind when you think about whether a given change in behavior qualifies as an example of learning. If the change was due to a drug, an injury, a disease, fatigue, or aging, then it doesn't represent an instance of learning. Okay. Well, guys, there's one more topic that I'd like to discuss with you before I conclude this overview of chapter one, and that is a very simple form of learning that's known as habituation. So remember, learning involves changes in behavior that result from experience, right? And in habituation, the behavioral change involves a particular response becoming weaker or less probable. Okay. So it sort of fades away. There's a decrease in the intensity or the frequency of the behavior. And what causes that decrease is the repeated presentation of the stimulus that normally elicits the behavior. So, guys, with habituation, you basically learn to get used to stuff. Okay. You learn to ignore, to stop responding to a particular stimulus because that stimulus keeps occurring over and over again. So it's almost like the repeated presentations of the stimulus make you sort of bored with it. So you become less responsive to it because the occurrence of that stimulus is just no longer as noteworthy as it once was. So, for example, if you live near a busy highway or a busy intersection, then when you first moved in, you probably found yourself distracted pretty often by the sounds of car horns and other traffic noises, right? At first, those sounds probably elicited a fairly strong response from you. That's why they were so distracting. But as time went on, as you kept hearing those sounds, as those stimuli continued to occur repeatedly in your environment, you probably got used to them. You probably habituated. There was probably a decrease in how strongly you came to respond to those stimuli. So, in other words, those sounds probably became less distracting over time because you eventually learned to ignore them. You eventually learned not to respond to them. That's called habituation. So, this is a relatively simple phenomenon, habituation. But again, the reason it's important, the reason it's covered in this opening chapter of the textbook is that it does qualify as an instance of learning. There's a change in behavior, the decreased responsiveness, and that change comes about as a result of experience. It's caused by previous occurrences of a stimulus, previous occurrences of an environmental event. So, as you might expect, habituation is an extremely widespread form of learning. We see organisms throughout the animal kingdom habituating to repeatedly presented stimuli. In fact, as your textbook author points out, even human fetuses will demonstrate habituation. So, the first time a fetus is presented with an unexpected stimulus, like a noise or a touch on the mother's abdomen, it will respond to it. For example, that stimulus will elicit movement by the fetus, but as the stimulus is presented again and again, that response wanes. So the fetus eventually learns to ignore the stimulus, much like you might have learned to ignore the ticking of your wristwatch or the flickering of a light bulb that you haven't gotten around to changing yet. So again, habituation is a very simple but very common form of learning. And so an important question to ask about it is, why is it so common? Right? Why is it that we see this kind of learning in all species, from the simplest to the most complex? In other words, what benefit does an animal stand to gain by habituating to repeatedly presented stimuli? Well, think about it. At any given moment, you and other animals are basically being bombarded by tons of different stimuli, right? From images to sounds to odors to touches and so on. And if you were to respond to all of those stimuli with full strength responses, then you drive yourself nuts, right? It would be extremely difficult for you to function in the complex world that you live in if you didn't learn to ignore some stimuli. So basically, guys, habituation represents a mechanism by which we figure out which stimuli are unimportant, which stimuli are essentially irrelevant, which ones we can afford to ignore, so that we can reserve our energy and our attention for the more important stimuli in our environment. Because after all, we only have so much time and so much brain power, right? So habituation is adaptive. It's been favored by natural selection because it basically enables us to use our time and our cognitive resources, like attention, more judiciously. Okay, well, that's going to just about do it for this video lecture. But before I wrap things up here, I do want to remind you to make sure that you complete the weekly quiz for this week. You can find the link to that right here in Canvas. So make sure you get that done before the weekends on Sunday. And please also make sure that you get the weekly activity done before the weekends. The link to the week 2 activity is right here. It's just above the link to the week 2 quiz. And if you click on that, you'll see that I've given you some instructions for how to complete the activity. Basically, what you're going to be doing is a simulation where you play the part of a predator. You're this sort of wolf like predator, and you're going to be hunting for two types of prey animals, a gray type and a brown type. So, those prey animals will move all over the place like this. And to catch one of them, you just have to click on them or tap on the screen, I guess, if you're doing the simulation on your phone, which you can do. Now, I want you to run the simulation 3 times for each type of environment. Okay, so you'll do 9 simulations overall, 3 for the grassland environment, 3 for the mountain rock environment, and 3 for the desert sand environment. And you'll need to record and summarize the results that you get for each environment. Okay, and then there are some questions that you'll need to answer too when you submit the activity. So again, the instructions for the activity can be found right here in Canvas. This is what you see when you click on that week 2 activity link. And when you're ready to submit, you'll obviously just click on Start Assignment right here. And then you can either attach any pictures or any other files that you need to. Or if you click on this text entry tab here, then you can just type your submission directly into Canvas. Either way is fine, but again, make sure that you get this activity and the week 2 quiz done and submitted before the end of the day on Sunday, January 22nd, because that's the official end of week 2 of this course. Okay, well, that's all I've got for you for this video lecture. But as always, if you do have questions about anything, then please let me know. You can send me an email. My email address is shown right here at the top of the syllabus. Or if you want to stop by my Zoom meeting room during my office hours, then that works too. The link to that Zoom room is also available right here at the top of the syllabus. Okay, take care, guys.